Then before you knew it, we were back at school. I went to the primary school just round the corner from us, Constable Street. Named after a painter by all accounts. I thought it was another case of there being a constant police presence down there, but apparently not. But that's great, innit? I mean, imagine that. You've done such a good job decorating a whole street that they want to name it after you. It made me wonder what extraordinary act of civic duty Chris Chilton had performed at our nearest rivals just over the other side of the boulevard. I didn't mind school so much, and used to quite look forward to turning up on the first day in me brand new wellies. Some kids turned up in sannies, short for sandshoes or plimsolls, but Mam drew the line at them. She said there were levels and you shouldn't go below them. Not unless you want to get saturated, you shouldn't. And no first day back at school was ever complete without a visit from the knit nurse. We didn't call them knits back then. We called them dicks, which sounds totally wrong. I mean, can you imagine? Your hair's full of dicks. Totally wrong. Where still we had a rhyme. I made you look, I made you stare, I made you cut the barber's hair was full of dicks, I made you eat them all but 6. Tez said it reminded him of a girl he knew, a hairdresser, who was very popular within a circle of him and his mates. He reckoned she'd inspired him to write a song, which he'd totally forgotten about, until he'd heard something that sounded almost identical about 10 or so years later, right down to the name even. Eileen. It was at school that I first discovered my love of the stage. I started small playing an innkeeper in the school nativity. You know, one of the ones who turns Mary and Joseph away. That struck me as totally pointless. I mean, didn't they have no vacancy signs back in biblical times? It would have saved a lot of bother, wouldn't it? It'd have been a whole different story if Jesus had been born in Withersea. But I must have done something right, because the next year I got a part in the school play, The Wizard of Oz. I played the Scarecrow, and I got a great review in the local paper. They said I was outstanding in my field, which knocked the stuffing out of me. I mean, it made me feel like I might have a brain in me head after all. Even though I didn't mind school, I still used to try and stay off every now and then. Like I said, I didn't mind it, but staying off was the only way that you could get Lucozade back then. And I loved Lucozade. You know, the original rust-coloured glucose-style AIDS recovery Lucozade. Back then there was only one flavour, and it was really difficult to get hold of. Nowadays it comes in lots of different flavours and anyone can get it. I saw one recently. Melon and cauliflower. I mean, that's just sad, isn't it? But even if I did stay off, I didn't feel like I was missing out. Mam would always tell me a story or two, or maybe talk about life. She had some great ready-made sayings she was always willing to pass on. Stuff like, if you love someone, set them free. If they come back, they clearly didn't get the message, did they? Or, if you can walk a mile in another person's shoes, it's probably best to only go half a mile, because they're going to want them back at some point, aren't they? You know, proper common sense stuff. Sometimes Les would do the honours, and having given up on trying to teach me about books like Steppenwolf or On the Road, he was making me recite stuff like, education in and of itself is a worthwhile pursuit, but the main purpose of schooling is to condition the individual into accepting without question a perceived set of societal norms that he or she thus replicates in the form of blind adherence to a hierarchical, mechanistic and ultimately capitalistic existence. After that I was always keen to get back to school. In truth, you didn't want to be off too much anyway, because you'd miss out on stuff, and it'd be really obvious when you got back. Like the time one of the teachers asked the class to name 2 things that Raleigh had brought back from the New World, and even though I'd been off, I put my hand up and said, the chopper and the tomahawk. That's how obsessed I was with bikes. Well, the teacher wasn't impressed at all. They called me a stupid get, and said they'd get more sense out of a potato. But I didn't care. 'cause I'd discovered something more important to my mind than any lesson about Walter Raleigh. I'd discovered I could make people laugh. My obsession with getting a bike had led me to something that was going to be a calling, and I wasn't talking about becoming an Avon lady. Autumn also meant that it wouldn't be long before the fair came around, and that was another thing I used to love. Mam wasn't so keen. She said it always put her in mind of that film Carousel. You know, the part where the main guy falls on his knife. Apparently Dad had done a similar thing, trying to nick one of those plastic swords off of a stall, and nearly did himself an injury. Not so much you'll never walk alone, more you'll never walk again. Well, not without the assistance of a pacemaker anyway. Mam did tell me an interesting thing though. Apparently, because of the fair, everybody on Walton Street has developed a really strong sense of community. So much so, they all say goodnight to each other before putting the lights out on a night. Go down there, you can hear them, she'd say. Good night, Elizabeth. Good night, Jason. After which, they'd all take it in turns for someone to play a little harmonica and a tiny xylophone. Anyway, Uncle Sandy would have to take me along. Always coming at it from the Anlaby Road end, obviously. I mean, even if we hadn't lived that way on, Uncle Sandy said we'd have to still come at it from the Anlaby Road end. He said to go from the Springbank West end was to go at things too quickly, and we'd end up experiencing the main event prematurely. He reckoned you should take your time getting there, working your way slowly and building up the excitement as you go. Maybe even grabbing the odd toy. And then he'd make me cringe again by saying, it's pretty much the same way as I have to approach your mam. I can remember the first year he took me. We stopped at pretty much every stall on the way, which meant by the time I got to any rides, I was already full of brandy snap, candy floss, and plenty of other sweets that didn't immediately lend their name to those of exotic dancers. We went on loads of other stuff before we finally got to the waltzers, which he'd been promising to take me on all year. The lady looking after our car was big and tough looking, and wearing a vest, with lots of tattoos on display. A die-hard, basically. Because of her job, Uncle Sandy referred to her as a spinster, which would have been all right had she not heard him, and then decided to give us the ride of our lives, just as the sounds of Son of My Father started kicking in as well. I tell you what, she spun us round so much and with such force, it wasn't long before I was throwing up everywhere, and in particular, all over Uncle Sandy, which I thought he'd be used to given his job. But he must have found it traumatising, 'cause he was screaming his head off, shouting, "Hook a duck! Hook a duck!" or something like that. So that's what we did, once the ride had finished. Obviously once Uncle Sandy had removed all the traces of brandy snap and candy floss, as well as other sweets that didn't immediately lend their name to those of exotic dancers. We headed off to the Hook a Duck stall before winning, as you do, and then facing the biggest Hull Fair challenge of all, getting the goldfish home before it dies. Me personally, I was never able to get a fish to the other end of Walton Street before it had its chips. Of course, nowadays we all realise that keeping goldfish in bags at a fair is cruel. I heard a story that one year a group of fish rights activists came over from Goole and freed a load of them. Fish Rights in Goole they were called. It was through Fish Rights in Goole that I found out what the word acronym means, 'cause they had a particularly memorable one. What they did, having grabbed them all off of the stalls, was take them over to Prince's Quay. I mean, how they got them there I don't know, but it meant they could grow to their full size in a more suitable surrounding. They're still there today if you look. If you don't know, by the way, Prince's Quay is a former dock in the centre of Hull, as opposed to the device that you use to open a can of luncheon meat. That'd be even worse, wouldn't it? keeping a goldfish in a half can of luncheon meat. Still, I suppose it's a step up from keeping one in a pilchard can.